Welcome to another Big Picture episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, where I chat with Pete Wargent. Since our last chat, a lot's happened, including rising inflation causing embarrassment to the Reserve Bank, with some commentators now speculating interest rates are even going to rise again. As usual, there are clues in the news as to what's ahead for our economy and our housing markets, and I'm looking forward to discussing these in this month's podcast with leading financial commentator Pete Wargent, who brings decades of perspective to his views. As always, we're going to discuss a raft of macro and microeconomic factors that should give you some clues as to what's ahead for our housing markets. So, let's get on with the show.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
Well, Pete, I always enjoy our Big Picture podcast chats, and I'm interested to hear where you are because you're in different parts of the world when I follow you on social media. Where in the world are you at present?
I'm in England this week. It's Wimbledon week over here, so true to form. I'm sure the weather's going to turn for the cloudier this week, but I've just been over in England for the past couple of weeks, just doing some family bits and pieces, and it's good to be over for a European summer.
Well, you're missing the cold winter at the moment, in Melbourne in particular, where we've had it very cold. Now, one of the big news items since we last spoke, and it is a little bit old at the moment, but it's still worth discussing to give context of what's ahead for our housing markets, is that May delivered a disappointing inflation reading. And now many commentators are suggesting that unless the economic data improves, it's possible interest rates will rise again, maybe even as early as August. Now, of course, you can't just trust 1 month's figures, and these are the monthly, not the quarterly results, which are generally more accurate, but boy, they've got a bit of a lag. So what were your thoughts when the inflation figure came out?
You're right. So these monthly inflation figures, they only actually got introduced a couple of years ago, 2022. Before that, we only ever used to get the quarterly figures from the ABS, and they don't map across exactly because the monthly figures, they don't measure all of the parts of the inflation basket. But as you said, monthly inflation gauge over the year to May was 4%, so still well above the target, which is 2 to 3. And that was a rebound, but that was partly because we had a very weak monthly inflation figure dropping out of the annual figure, if that makes any sense, from a year earlier. But for the next 4 months, the reverse will be true. So we'll see headline inflation. If you think about June, July, August, September, we'll see it drop back down to around 3%. Plus, the government's actually introducing a whole range of new cost of living subsidies from 1 July. So that will kind of hack that headline figure lower. There's other gauges as well. Melbourne Institute had its data out this week that actually showed core inflation back at 3%, which is the top of the target.
Yeah.
Now, as you mentioned, the official quarterly data is out 31st of July. So I think the thing to watch there will be not so much the headline inflation, but the core inflation or the trimmed mean. And I think if we get 0.9% or below, then the Reserve Bank will just stay on hold for the next 3 to 6 months and let the contractionary monetary policy settings do their thing. If we get a reading of 1% or above, that could be different, and the Reserve Bank will be forced into a hike on the 6th of August. But look, on the balance of probabilities anyway, most likely on hold.
Well, there's also been other inflationary factors. The federal budget has given us more money, which allows us to spend a bit more. And each state budget, that actually hasn't helped. They've been giving tax cuts, excessive government spending at all levels isn't helping either, is it?
Well, that's right. And you can point the finger at any number of different factors. We had a big stimulus, of course, the JobKeeper through COVID. And then, the NDIS looks like it's snowballing into some massive overruns. And just structurally, the budget is still, well, spending is very high. So that hasn't helped. I think if you look at the other factors, rents have been very strong over the past year. Hopefully those are easing off. But also electricity prices, which would be very disappointing, I think, for the government, because obviously the previous election campaign, that was one of the pledges, would bring down your power bills. But it hasn't really happened. And the cost of living subsidies will help in the second half of the year. But yeah, the reality is, if you look at futures prices for electricity, not great at the moment. So there's some factors which are a little bit disappointing. So yeah, but some things are inside the government's control and some things aren't.
Well, many Australians are suffering from a rising cost of living. They're having challenges. But there seem to be two groups of Australians: young people with no debt, and sometimes they've got rich parents, and also baby boomers with no debt. They're still spending up big, aren't they?
That's right. I think if you look at the latest retail figures, the turnover was actually up over the past month. I think the ABS partly attributed that to businesses discounting, so some early end of financial year sales offers and promotions. So yeah, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think definitely people with substantial mortgages will definitely be feeling the pinch, and as those fixed rate mortgages keep resetting to higher rates, that's really sort of cutting people's spending back there. But yeah, I've noticed myself the same in Europe. There's lots of older people out and about, and if they've paid off their mortgage and they're getting a bit more on their term deposits, yeah, look, there's still people out there spending. It's just not the same right across the board.
Well, interestingly, at the moment, everybody seems to be in Bali during the school holidays. So it seems like people are out spending. But the Reserve Bank has taken a slightly different route to some of the overseas banks. It didn't raise rates as much, even though there's no doubt that they raised rates 13 times. But compared to more restrictive levels in other advanced economies, I think that's been because they didn't want to harm the labour market too much, create too much unemployment. But this may mean that the rates are going to need to remain higher for longer than in other parts of the world to bring inflation under control. I think most economists are now suggesting rate cuts won't start till either late this year or much more likely into 2025, Pete.
It does feel that way. I think there's a few things that are a bit different. If you compare the UK or the US or even New Zealand to some degree, Australia's basically got most people on variable rate mortgages, or for a brief period, we had a lot of people on 1 to 2 year fixed rate mortgages, but most of those have now reset back to variable. And also we've got relatively high levels of household debt. So just to explain that in plain English, a lot of people in the US, they would actually have a fixed rate mortgage for the entire life of the loan.
30 years often,
yeah, that's right, 30-year fixed rate. We just don't have that product available in Australia for a number of reasons, different bond markets and so on. The interest rate hikes in Australia, in theory anyway, should have a greater impact and sooner. We have had some issues on the supply side that have kept inflation higher than might otherwise have been the case. But I guess in theory, interest rates haven't needed to go as high. So our cash rate target's 4.35%, some way lower than what we've seen in the US, UK, and New Zealand. But yeah, if you look at, as we sit here today, well, market pricing suggests that, yes, by the end of 2025, we might be starting to see interest rate cuts. But until then, yeah, the market looks pretty flat, to be honest. So yeah, a lot can change. But at the moment, higher for longer seems to be the theme still.
Well, that's going to concern some people in the housing market. It's going to put pressure on some. But despite that, house prices have kept rising now 18 months in a row. Depends whose reports you look at, PropTrack, CoreLogic, Dr. Andrew Wilson's My Housing Market. But basically, overall, our markets have kept rising, but they've been very fragmented this year with some big booming markets, Adelaide, Brisbane, Perth, and the other markets not doing as well. But we're needing more housing supply. House prices have increased, mortgage rates have gone up higher, but we actually aren't building more. I know that recently in your podcast I enjoy listening to your podcast on a Sunday, your 2 Cents podcast. You mentioned an article that caught my attention as well in realestate.com that suggested that we actually have to have rising house prices to unlock new housing supply, Eleanor Craig had mentioned.
Yes, Eleanor wrote about it. Also, Cameron Cusher as well did a piece for PropTrack. And yeah, a very similar theme. So as we speak, actually, this week is the start of the Housing Accord target period. So from 1 July 2024, for the next 5 years, the government wants to see 1.2 million homes built by 2029. But as Cameron pointed out in his piece, if you break that down, that's 240,000 dwellings a year or 20,000 a month. Now, we've never built at that kind of rate before. And Cameron pointed out there's essentially 4 challenges for why that's just not going to happen. The first thing is the only time we've seen levels of construction that high was around 2017. But the cash rate target then was 1.5%. Today we're at 4.35%. So that's one massive factor. The rates are just too high for that level of construction. There's relatively fewer investors in the market as compared to back then, and especially Chinese buyers of new apartments. So that's another factor. If investors aren't buying, stuff's not getting built, essentially. Construction costs are up about 40% since the onset of the pandemic. So that's going to hold back new medium density projects. And also you've got planning constraints as well, which don't necessarily help. So I think there's some parts of the country where you've got house approvals rising, particularly Perth, and maybe a little bit Melbourne and Brisbane, but there's very little unit supply. And that's what's going to keep things tight. There's a few coastal areas, Gold Coast or Redcliffe, where developers are building stuff with sea views for downsizers. But if you look across the country, very, very low, especially in Sydney and Brisbane. So, yeah, 1.2 million homes, it's a nice announcement, but in reality, we're not going to see it.
Well, recently the May housing approval figures came out, and yes, they shot up a little bit, but we're still nowhere near the sort of figures we're going to need to reach that target. We've discussed that in previous shows. Don't have to say it again. The fact that it's not just viable at the moment to build those new medium density properties. And part of it, as you said, is the developers can't sell off the plan at the moment to get the funding to get things moving. Now, recently there was a report about foreign buyers in Australia, and while we have, I guess, pulled out the welcome mat from under them by putting extra taxes and extra properties, extra costs in their way, also foreign buyers have had challenges back home, particularly in China. But there has been an increase in foreign purchases in Australia recently.
Well, that's right. The Treasury figures do lag an awful lot. So they were for the financial year to 30 June 2022. So I think there was a big interruption through the COVID period, like everywhere in the world. I think the thing is, when you look at, let's say just over 5,000 foreign purchases over that financial year, it's an increase for sure, but it pales into insignificance when you compare to FY 2016, when all those tower blocks were going up. We had about 40,000 residential approvals from the Foreign Investment Review Board for real estate, and that was about $70 billion worth for residential overall. So most of that, this ties back to what we were just talking about before, a huge amount of that was going into new apartments, and especially from investors in mainland China. Since then, well, we've got stamp duty surcharges. The state government seem very reluctant to remove them. I don't know whether that's a revenue thing or maybe it's a political issue, but we don't seem to be encouraging the foreign investors back into the market. So that is actually one of the key factors as to why we're not going to see the levels of construction that we did see in 2017. So it's holding back the market overall.
Well, again, you mentioned the figure in the 2022-23 financial year. That was the last one that came out, and it's a big lag, though. There was only 5,360 properties that were purchased by foreign investors. An average purchase price was $914,000, and they only constitute probably about 1% of all real estate purchases in Australia. So it's not foreign buyers who are pushing up property prices or cutting out first home buyers, is it, Pete?
Not really. I think sometimes at the margin, foreign capital can make a difference. But, there's always this debate about, well, what constitutes a foreign buyer? Is it, an Australian resident who was born overseas, because that would include somebody like myself, or is it a foreign buyer who's got FIRB approval to buy a new property? But then there's this kind of grey area where you get maybe, I don't know, international students, and there's family and there's money being transmitted. There's I mean, there's almost no way to track that. Now, the NAB survey tries to, with some surveys of foreign buyers of property, which is somewhat different from what the Treasury measures. But yeah, I think it's on the increase again. But I guess overall, yeah, if you're talking about 5,000 approvals by the Treasury numbers over the course of a year, I mean, that's small fry in the context of population growth of 650,000 last year. So yeah, it's not the main driver of prices, I would say.
No. Look, there was lots of negative news, worrying news over the last month since we last had our chat. But one of the good bits of news was household wealth increased in the March quarter. Again, a lot of these ABS statistics are lagging, but it makes sense because a huge percentage of household wealth is in our homes and again in our super funds, Pete.
Yeah, so London dwellings added another 230 billion. It's quite a lot when you put it like that. It's nearly $250 billion over the March quarter. And over the past year, actually, London dwellings nearly $1.5 trillion higher. And super added another 145 billion in the first quarter of the year. So that's 350 billion over the year. Of course, household debt has also increased a little. But yeah, look, if you look over the year to March, that's a 10% increase in household wealth, or 1.5 trillion. So another 2.7% in the March quarter. I think if you just zoom out a little bit, you can see that household wealth during the financial crisis in Australia fell from about 6 trillion to 5.3 trillion. Well, today it's 16.2. So if you ever need an example of compounding in action, there you go. Household wealth has tripled since 2009. And it just goes back to that old quote, never interrupt compounding unnecessarily. Because, yes, we've had population growth over that time. But that's a tremendous increase in wealth over 15 years. And London dwellings has been a big part of it, and superannuation and shares as well.
Well, that's interesting because people are always asking, is this a good time to buy? Is this a good time to sell? Should I maybe not get into the property market at the moment when the governments are making it harder for property investors, favouring the tenants? But only a couple of days ago, I spoke to somebody who came from Singapore, bought some properties in Melbourne and in Sydney using our services 10 years ago. And then he went back to Singapore. He was in England for 7 years, and he just came back to see how his properties were going. And boy, they'd doubled, and they'd almost, not doubled again, but over the last decade, they'd done very, very well. He just went away, left them alone, and came back, and prime positions that he purchased investments in using our services, left them alone. The rents kept going up, the values increased. He was actually telling me he's virtually paid off his mortgages, and now at 50, he's that plus his other investments. He's got some other really good investments. He's just living off his investment portfolio.
Well, what's the old phrase? Don't just do something, stand there. Yeah, sometimes doing nothing can be the most powerful force when if you've got good quality investments. There can be long periods where there's not much to do, as long as you buy well and let time do the heavy lifting. So yeah, interesting. It's definitely been a strong period, and that's continued over the past 6 quarters in a row now of household wealth going up for Australia. So pretty strong.
Interestingly, one of the things he did was a small townhouse development, 2 townhouses in Melbourne that Metropole specialises in. And we talked about what he paid for the land in a good suburb in Bentley at the time, and it was $700,000, which seemed like a lot of money in 2006 when he bought that 2016 when he bought that particular property 18 years ago. Today that land would be worth 1.6 or so, more than doubled. And the construction cost, interestingly, boy, that seemed expensive. It was $800,000. Today to build 2 similar townhouses would be $1.8 million. That goes in line with what you're saying about the increase in construction costs. It creeps up slowly, but if you look back over, even less than a decade, it has made a big difference that's what's going to underpin property values moving forward. Now, Pete, we know the Reserve Bank's been trying to battle inflation through rising interest rates, and one would suspect they wanted unemployment rates to lift because low unemployment can lead to wages pressure and, of course, inflationary tendencies. We didn't get that wage price spiral some were worrying about. Yet, despite our huge surge in immigration, meaning there are actually more people looking for jobs, unemployment levels have remained low and participation rates have remained high because clearly we're creating more jobs. That's why inflation hasn't come under control as well. Our economy's still growing. However, it seems things may be starting to change, Pete. Job vacancies are starting to drop now.
Yes, so far, unemployment has remained very low. But then if you look at other countries like Canada, for example, unemployment was low and then suddenly, bang, it was about 5%. And I think if you actually look at the job vacancies figures, well, they're down, ANZ have them down 26% from 2022. Now, that was from a record high, so they had to come down. But then at the same time, we've seen a massive increase in the size of the labour force because of immigration. So I think you can do some funny sort of inverted charts and overlays. And what they seem to suggest is the unemployment rate going to about 4.5% if you look at the ABS figures. If you look at ANZ's figures, maybe 5%. You know, it's not an exact science, but it does seem to be that, yes, wages pressures are coming off. So you can see that in SEEK's advertised wages index. Things are leveling off there. But also, yeah, there's just not as many applicants for every job now. The unemployed persons per vacant job, yeah, it's lifting again. So we went through an extraordinary period where there was basically a job vacancy for every unemployed person. That's completely unheard of. But that's kind of changed now. And yeah, immigration's still pretty strong. Job vacancies are coming down. So I think if you look at those as being a lead indicator, you'd probably expect to see unemployment rising from here.
But I don't think anyone would have thought unemployment would have a 3 in front of it as it's had for a while. I remember when I first started learning about economics, the unemployment rate used to, if it was less than 10, you thought that was what structural unemployment in this country was about. So I guess what we're saying is that unemployment is going to rise a little bit. The Reserve Bank wants that, but that's going to maybe slow inflationary pressures down a little bit, but there's still jobs out there if you're wanting them. Now, Pete, I do want to discuss another topic with you today, but before we do, I'd like to maybe just see how things are going on your side of the world, even though you're there. You had a new book come out. We mentioned it last time, but maybe you could tell us how that's travelling. Tell us about your new book.
Yeah, pretty good.
Well, in fact, I remember when we first met, it was because of your first book many years ago. Now you're a multiply book published author. How many books is that now?
Oh gosh, I think this is my 7th published book. So yeah, it's been a journey. That's over about 13, 14 years or so now. The buy right approach to property investing, mastering the skills to invest wisely in properties. I've co-authored this book with Kate Bakos, and you'll see this in your travels if you go to the airport bookstores, or Dimmicks are doing an end of year promo for it, or these days a lot of people just buy on Amazon or straight from our publisher at Major Street. So it's great to sort of get another book on the shelves, because there was a strange period through COVID where the bookstores weren't open. So it's exciting to see people getting back into the stores. And it's a really good read because Kate brings it to life with a lot of her sort of first-hand experiences in the real estate market at the coalface. And we go back a long way. And of course, I know you know Kate as well. So
definitely. So I'll leave a link in the show notes to that. And often the easiest way to do that is just buy it on Amazon or Kindle anyway. So I'll leave a link in the show notes to that. Pete, I enjoy reading your daily blogs, and I'll leave a link to that in the show notes. And I enjoy your podcast, particularly the one on Sundays with Chris Bates, where when I take my dog Lincoln for a walk, you cover 3 news stories, and just a bit like we cover the news stories here. But in one of your daily blogs, you wrote about the current state of lending and how that's changed. We know borrowers have been knocked by 13 interest rate rises, but you explained that doesn't really reveal the full picture.
Well, no, I think it's a little bit like boiling frogs, because if you went back to the pre-financial crisis days, well, lending was relatively loose back then. Of course, post-GFC, there's been a number of things that have changed. One is the total amount of debt that people can borrow since 2014. It's really capped as a multiple of your income, but also the share of interest-only loans. If you went back to around sort of 7-8 years ago, it was about 40% of the market by value was on interest only. Now it's only 11%. So there's been a huge squeeze there.
So in other words, they're principal and interest, which means it actually takes up more of your budget to keep your mortgages.
Exactly. So the interest rate hikes have had a bigger impact because of that, because after you account for the principal repayments, mortgage repayments have lifted higher, and now mortgage arrears are on the up, and more people are getting into mortgage stress. I think there was actually a speech by APRA, John Lonsdale, only a week or two ago, and he talked about, we're not only interested in tightening lending standards, and at some point you can tighten the screw too far and banks just can't take risk. At the moment, we've got a lending assessment buffer. So if you want to borrow at, say, 6.5%, the bank has to stress test you at 9.5%, which is a mortgage rate you're never going to pay effectively. No. And a lot of stuff's changed. The big four banks in Australia now are among the best capitalised in the world. So this is a whole different planet from where things were at in 2007. So at some point that conversation will shift. I noticed ANZ are already saying, we're locking people out of the market with these tight lending standards. So the push is on from banks to be able to take more risk. But in the meantime, the rental market tremendously tight.
Well, we want our banking system to be solid and secure. I do remember those 2007, 2008 times when you could have no doc loans, low doc loans, almost even capitalising your interest type loans. And if the global financial crisis hadn't occurred overseas, we could have run into some of those troubles here as well. But it does seem that APRA has gone too far in the other direction and made it more difficult for investors. While it's securing the banking system, it is leading to a rental crisis because the government's depending upon investors to provide accommodation. Even though there has been a little bit of news recently about incentives by the various state governments to start providing some social accommodation, something that they've really left by the wayside. They really haven't done their job providing social accommodation for the disenfranchised in our country.
No, I think if you look back over the decades, most of the income quintiles in Australia, they've paid kind of the same amount of their income on rent over the past 30, 40 years. It's just at that bottom quintile, it's the lowest income earners where the social housing and the affordable housing just hasn't been provided by the government. And that's where there's been a real issue in terms of rising rents and not the available accommodation that there should be. So yeah, look, at the moment, it seems like rents might have hit a bit of a plateau, but it's a funny time of year, this. The middle of the year, it tends to be a bit more seasonal these days because we've got so many temporary visa holders in Australia, nearly 3 million now. I think when you see the summer university terms and the sort of warmer summer months, I think we might see the rental vacancies tightening again. So yeah, at the moment, the demand for rentals is not really being met. And the rental markets are extremely tight.
Well, the recent domain rental report was headlined Relief for Tenants because there wasn't much rental increase in the last month. Having said that, vacancy rates still are at historic lows, so maybe rents won't have the double-digit growth this year than they had for the last couple of years, but I can't see them going anywhere but up. I know at Metropole Property Management, anytime we put a property on the market that's fairly priced, even though we're putting rents up to protect our landlords, there's a queue of tenants there, a queue of applicants there, and landlords are at least covering some of their extra costs, but it's not because they're greedy that they're putting up the rents. Boy, the cost of owning a property has become more expensive over the last couple of years, Pete.
Yeah, it hasn't been helped actually at the state level with changes to land tax thresholds, changes to tenancy rights, and of course mortgage repayments have gone up and insurance premiums have also gone up. So there's been a whole range of factors that have come together to make ownership more expensive. And to the extent possible, landlords tend to try and push that on to tenants. I think in some parts of the market, maybe rents are bumping up against an affordability ceiling. Yeah, and look, some parts of the country, the rental markets are quite soft. But if you look at Melbourne over the last quarter, 1.8% increase in rent. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely in the big cities, there's a lot of pressure there. And yeah, the supply is just not keeping pace at the moment. It's difficult to find a quality rental at the moment, and that's one of the things that's causing a lot of first-time buyers to try and borrow money from their parents or grandparents and just get onto the ladder any way they can.
Well, we know that governments are using private investors as scapegoats for their shocking uninvestment in social housing or for their budget deficits, and that's meant that more investors are just wondering, should I stay in the market or should I even get in the market? But if you remember that story I mentioned about Jed, was the gentleman's name, who bought these properties in Sydney and Melbourne, then just went away and came back 10 years later, 8 years later for the other one. The properties did exactly what they were meant to do. So remember the big picture rather than getting caught up in the day-to-day negative news cycle. Pete, I've already mentioned about your blog and your book, and I'm going to leave links in the show notes to that. But if people want to keep in contact with you between now and our next chat in a month's time, how do they find you?
Yeah, PeteWargent.com is my website, or Pete Wargent Blogspot. If you're really bored, you can follow me on Twitter, or X as they call it these days, at Pete Wargent, where I'm way too active most
You're
days.
You're very active there.
Yeah, my wife Heather keeps telling me to spend less time on social media, but it's very addictive, so difficult to do.
It is, isn't it? Boy, it's to change the way we get our news. I think one of the stories from that is you've got to be really careful who you follow and who you listen to on social media, because it is a bit of a rabbit warren. It knows the sort of things you're interested in, so it keeps bringing you the sort of information, whether it's real estate, sport, whatever the topics you start looking at, it keeps coming up, doesn't it?
It does. I've been reading a book actually about why you should stop reading the news, which is quite compelling. That's quite extreme for people like us who are interested in the news, but maybe just choosing your sources a bit more carefully. And even there's a good argument for reading a bit more print media because it's a bit less sort of clickbaity and a bit more considered maybe. So yeah, I think it's, choose your information sources wisely, because you can find something to confirm any bias you've got these days. So you need to be a bit
definitely.
careful.
Well, thanks again, Pete. Look forward to catching up with you in a month's time.
Sounds good. Thanks, Michael.
If you enjoyed my chat with Pete and you don't currently subscribe or follow this show, before we get on to the next couple of segments, please just stop for a sec on whatever podcast player you're listening to this on, or even a lot of people listen to this on YouTube. Just subscribe to the show, so twice a week you're going to get information from my guests and me. And one of the things we just talked about a moment ago with Pete was that if you're like me, your inbox is inundated with offers to help you become financially free through property. There are webinars, masterclasses, property gurus, a new band of buyers agents. But we actually made a comment that you've really got to be careful who you listen to. Of course, the property market's performed strongly over the last few years, so meant we've got a whole new generation of property, well, let's call them experts, and now they're encouraging you to come along and hear their theories. However, the problem for those interested in property is that, well, in today's changing market, it's more important than ever, as Pete and I were saying, to receive unbiased advice. Of course, it's hard to know who to listen to, isn't it? Sure, I'm biased. I'd like you to work with my team at Metropole, but we've got no properties for sale. We've got on-the-ground teams in the 3 largest property markets in Australia. We've got all the research available on property going back 45 years. Look, a lot of people are data-driven at the moment, but that's not anywhere near as important as having the perspective to understand and interpret the data, understand what it all means. And we're much more than just another buyer's agent. At Metropole, we help our clients safely outperform the markets and create intergenerational wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. So why not go to metropole.com.au and lock in a time for a complimentary wealth discovery chat with one of Metropole's wealth strategists? Why not discuss your options? I believe it's a great time to invest. We spoke about that just a moment ago with Pete, but I also think this would be a great investment of your time with so much happening in the market. If you really want to secure your family's financial future, go to metropole.com.au and have a chat with one of my team.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I'd like to share with you a snippet of a very famous speech by former American President Teddy Roosevelt, and it was about critics. And in life, you're going to come against critics, people who criticize you, people who say it can't be done, who people say you're not up to it, you're not good enough. Why are you doing it that way? That's the old tall poppy syndrome, isn't it, here in Australia, when we put our heads up and try to do better, be better, improve things, people want to lop it down. So I hope this will give you some inspiration, because over time, if you actually go out of your comfort zone and try and do things, people are going to criticise you, and particularly so on social media. Anyway, on April 23rd, 1910, Theodore Roosevelt gave what was going to become one of the most widely quoted speeches of his career. Remember, he was a former president of the United States, but he left office in 1909, long before any of us were born. And in this speech, Roosevelt spoke against cynics who looked down on men who were trying to make the world a better place. He said something along the lines of, the poorest way to face life is to face it with a sneer. He said, a cynic's habit of thought and speech, a readiness to criticise work which the critic himself has never even tried to perform, it's an intellectual aloofness which will not accept contact with life's realities. All these are marks not of superiority, but weakness. In other words, he was saying the critics are weak, not the person who hasn't succeeded. But then he went on and delivered an inspirational, impassioned message that drew huge applause. So here are some of the most quoted paragraphs from his famous speech. He said, it's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how strong the man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done better themselves. Teddy Roosevelt said, the credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena. It belongs to the man whose face is marred with dust and sweat and blood, to the man who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there's no effort without error and shortcomings. But the credit belongs to the man who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasm, who knows great devotion, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement. But if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with the cold and timid souls who neither know victory or defeat. Very strong words, which well over a century later are still as relevant today. And I guess that's the reason these quotes have often been paraphrased in talks and lots of TED Talks. So my message to you today is, don't worry about the critics. Unfortunately, for some of us, we're our worst critic, but that's a totally different message. The message here is most of the critics actually sit on the sidelines. They're not in the arena. They don't try. It's too easy to be a critic. And today everyone's an expert. They're an expert on pandemics, even though they've never been to university. They're an expert on politics, even though they have never tried. They're experts on business or on property. Don't worry about the critics. Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney Podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?